Acts chapter 21. We'll start reading in verse number 27 this morning, and we'll finish out the chapter. But Acts chapter 21, verse 27, it says, "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into this temple and hath polluted this holy place.' For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, and they drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions, and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. And then the chief captain came near, and took him, and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was, that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, 'Away with him!' And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, 'May I speak unto thee?' Who said, 'Can thou speak Greek? Art not that the Egyptian which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?' But Paul said, 'I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people.' And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying." This is kind of the text that we've been building to for quite some time now, as Paul has been attempting to get to Jerusalem and has been making his way to Jerusalem for some time. And of course, along the way, we have seen the warnings, the prophecies concerning this particular time, things that begin to come to pass here in our text this morning. And so Paul now is finally in Jerusalem. We saw that last week when he finally made his way into Jerusalem, and as expected, was met with almost immediate resistance. And we talked about last week how the very first meeting between Paul and those of the church in Jerusalem was good, and there was rejoicing concerning the things that Paul had been able to see and do during his ministry, but then things quickly turned as they almost immediately go from rejoicing to accusations. And so they tell Paul, listen, everybody here is quite worried concerning the things that they've been hearing of you. They've been told that you are commanding Jews to not keep the law, and they give a litany of things, and they say, so you need to do this. You need to take these men. You need to go down to the temple. You need to be with them as they complete this vow. You need to pay for their sacrifices. You need to make it known that you are not a threat or an enemy of the Jewish people. And so he's met with almost immediate resistance. And so that was with the elders of the Jerusalem church, and we talked about this last week. They backed him into this corner. However, the Holy Spirit had said that bonds and afflictions were waiting on him, not just spiritual resistance. And so as bad as things were, they were about to get significantly worse. And that's what we see take place in our text this morning. And so again, as we pick it up in verse number 27, "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him." And so Paul there in verse 26, he takes those 4 Jewish men to the temple, and he's going through the rites that were required to make the completion of their vow. And so, again, I don't want to rehash all this. We don't know exactly what vow they made. Perhaps it was a Nazarite vow. Perhaps it was something else. But typically, the completion of the vow would be a 7-day process. And there would be sacrifices required at various points during that 7 days. Obviously, they would have to go through ceremonial cleansing. There's certain things that were involved in this. And so Paul's been there with them. They've been doing this for 7 days, making their way to the temple, going through all the required rites that were asked of him to do. And so the things were lasting for a week. However, Paul would not be given the opportunity to see this all the way to its completion. Because again, when the 7 days were almost ended. Now, we don't know if that means that this was day 7 and the 7th day was almost done, if this was day 6 and he almost made it to day 7. For whatever reason he gets almost to the end, and doesn't get the opportunity to make it all the way to day 7. And so what happens is there's a group of Jews that see Paul in the temple, and at that point, all chaos begins to fall out. And so we're not told who that group is, other than they're a group of Jews in the middle of verse 27, which were of Asia. Now, obviously that's in reference to the Roman province of Asia, and so there's a lot of people who think that they were maybe from Ephesus. We're not told who they or where they're from. Ephesus makes some sense. We know that Paul was a long time there in Ephesus. A lot of the Jews in Ephesus know who he is. We understand, Paul made a lot of enemies of the Jews in most of the cities he went to, unbelieving Jews, that is. And so, Ephesus is a good guess. We're not told, so, ultimately it doesn't matter where they're from. What they did is what matters. And so when they see Paul, they're immediately angered. In verse 27, again, they saw him in the temple. They stirred up all the people. And then immediately they go and they lay hands on Paul. And so they're immediately angry. They stir up the people. They seize him, and they begin dragging him out of the temple and making these wild accusations. And so we have to understand when this is taking place, because it gives us a little bit of context to this. A couple of times Paul has made reference to the fact that his desire was to be at Jerusalem by Pentecost. And so Pentecost was one of those a traveling feasts where Jews from all over would come to Jerusalem, to the temple, and so there would be a very, very large number of people, not just in Jerusalem, but specifically at the temple at this particular time. And some numbers vary on this. Josephus, I'll reference Josephus later on, but he was a Jewish historian, and he makes reference to some of these feasts. There would be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who came to Jerusalem for these particular feasts. So again, we don't know how many people were there, but a lot. I mean, that we can say most certainly. There were a lot of people at the temple at this particular time because Paul wanted to be there for Pentecost. And so they were able to get quite a large, and I think we can use the word mob, they were able to get a large mob of people together very, very quickly because they were all there in a very concentrated area. And so this wouldn't have been a very difficult thing to do. In fact, that's likely the reason that those Jews from Asia were there, was for Pentecost. And so, all these things are just kind of added together for one very bad situation for Paul. And so now that they've made a scene, right? They've grabbed Paul, they begin dragging him out, and now they begin crying out. And so they begin crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place." And so they immediately start crying out, "Hey, listen, if you're a Jew and you care about law, you care about Moses, you care about the temple, this is enemy number one." Right? This is the guy who's, and look at the boldness of their terms here. This is the guy who teaches everybody everywhere against the law, against the Jewish people, against the temple. Right? They know what buttons to push. If you remember back earlier in the book of Acts, these are the exact same accusations that they made against Stephen. They were saying the same thing. Stephen teaches against the law, he teaches against Moses, he teaches against the temple, and what eventually happened to Stephen? He's pulled before the Sanhedrin and ultimately killed. And so, again, they understand if we want to get to Paul, and if we want the Jews to help us get to Paul, these are the buttons to push to get them on our side. And so they start making these wild accusations. They make these insane statements. And also, add on top of that, what I've already mentioned, right? They're there for Pentecost. And so not only are these things sacred to Jews all the time, but they're there having traveled to the temple for the purposes of keeping the law. Right, so there's a heightened sense of reverence for these things at this particular time, and then they go on yelling against Paul. Hey, he doesn't care about this. He's teaching everybody everywhere against these things. And so again, like I mentioned earlier, it would not have been difficult for them to get a large group of people together on their side very, very quickly. They go on to say that Paul, that he brought Greeks also into the temple and hath polluted the holy place. Again, this is just a wild accusation. This is almost laughably wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Bible tells us, it says that they saw Trophimus at one point with Paul in the city, not in the temple. They just saw Paul and Trophimus together, and then they just assumed that Paul had brought Trophimus into the temple. Now, maybe they saw somebody in the temple that kind of looked like Trophimus. We don't know. Or they just saw Paul with him in the city and thought, well, if he's with him in the city, he's probably with him in the temple. Right? We don't know what made them make that leap in logic, but they start yelling out that Trophimus was brought into the temple. Now, again, laughably wrong for a couple of reasons. Number one, the whole reason Paul is there in the first place, the whole reason that Paul is even in Jerusalem, much less the temple, was to make inroads with the relationship between Jew and Gentile, specifically for the temple between him and the other Jews. Paul is not going to do something that's going to strain that relationship. He's going to great ends to make that relationship smoother. So the last thing he's going to do is to do something to as wild as bringing a Gentile into the temple that he knows is going to make a whole lot of problems worse. Furthermore, for Paul to bring Trophimus into the temple would mean that Paul was willingly leading Trophimus to his own death. There were courts. We've talked about this in the past, but in the temple, there was the temple right in the center on the Temple Mount, and then kind of stretching outwards, there were various courtyards. And based upon how close you could get to the temple would kind of determine what courtyard you were allowed in. And so right outside the temple, there was the area for the priests. And then right outside of that, there was an area for Jewish men. Right outside of that, there was an area for Jewish women. And then right outside of that was what's called the court of the Gentiles. Now, around the court of the Gentiles that separated them from the court of Jewish women was a barricade. And around that barricade were signs posted every few feet. And we have found some of them. Archaeologists have found some of these signs. We have them today. And these signs read as followed: "No man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame that his death ensues." So this was something that they kept zealously. And this was something that the Romans kind of allowed them to do. Right? This is a religious thing for them. And again, this comes into play later on. We've said it 100 times in the past. The Romans, what? They just want to keep the peace, right? That's what they want to do. And so they allowed this. The signs were well posted. Everybody knew about this particular rule. Again, all of this to say, the accusations that they're making about Paul, not only were they wildly inaccurate, everybody in that crowd knew they were wildly inaccurate. There's not a person in that mob who believed the things that they were claiming to be true. And that's kind of proven by something that happens a little bit later as well. But they got what they wanted. What they wanted was to get Paul, and they got what they wanted. It says, "And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut." Now, again, I don't know how many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people were there around the temple at that particular time. But again, as I've said, it would not take long for this to be a giant mob. People around the temple who lived in Jerusalem would hear about the yelling and all the things that were going on. They would hear this. That would naturally draw them out to see what was taking place at the temple. This thing it was like a flash flood. It just happened instantly, where things were just kind of normal, and then all of a sudden there was this violence, and they're dragging Paul out trying to kill him. All right, this just happened in just a matter of probably a few minutes. And so all the cities moved. People come together. They take Paul, and it says they drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. This is another proof that their claims were false. If they were actually mad about Trophimus, a Gentile, being in the temple, it's not Paul who would have been taken out. It would have been Trophimus. Because Paul was a Jew. He's allowed to be there. Right? By their own laws, Paul is allowed to be there. And so Trophimus would have been the one dragged out, not Paul. And so they drag Paul out of the inner courts, and they take him out probably in the court of the Gentiles, and they shut the doors behind him. It's finally, this is just such an interesting thing that Luke throws in here, that they shut the doors behind them as they drag Paul out. Why would they do that? Well, a couple of things. Number one, they don't want Gentiles sneaking in, right? But number two, the assumption is Paul's about to be killed. And so we're going to shut our doors lest some blood defile this temple. Now think about this. I'm going to show you how this is kind of similar to what they did with Christ. But there's this cognitive dissonance. That's the term that we would use for this. There's this cognitive dissonance that existed within the Jewish people, the Orthodox Jewish people at this particular time. Because here's what they were saying. What you're doing is so wrong that the blood, if it happens, is going to defile the temple. Just make sure when you do it, you don't do it here. We're okay with you doing it, just not here. Now, what did they do with Jesus? They lied. They willingly brought false witnesses against him. Why? Because they claim he was making claims of blasphemy. And so essentially what they're saying is, Jesus, we believe that you sinned, and so in order to stop it, we're going to sin against you. Right? And so so we'll justify the one and condemn the other. There's a cognitive dissonance that was existing there. And it's almost as if they don't even see the illogical things that are taking place within their own group here. And so they draw Paul out. Again, the assumption is here that they're likely dragging him out to stone him. That's the Jewish means of execution, that they're going to stone him. They drag him out and they shut the door behind him. And so we see in verse 31, and as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. So you see how quickly this thing spread. It's not just at the temple anymore. All Jerusalem is in an uproar. And so this is spreading remarkably fast. And we're going to see the response of the Roman soldiers, how serious of an issue they saw this. And so the tidings come into, it says, the chief captain of the band. The chief captain there was the leader of a Roman cohort. A Roman cohort was a group of 1,000 Roman soldiers. Those would be broken down into groups of 100 led by centurions. But the fact that this comes to the ears of a Roman, the leader of a cohort, tells us how serious of a thing this was. And so he knows the dangers that could happen if this situation is not put down quickly. Now also, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind. Now, remember, again, not only is the temple populated at this particular point with Jews from all over the empire, right? And so there's implications there. But the captain also knows that the last thing he needs right now is a riot in Jerusalem at a time where there was already an incredible strain in the Roman-Jewish relationship, right? And so just to get a historical perspective here, not only do have the Jews really for the entire time they were under Roman rule hated the Romans, they hated being ruled by the Romans, right? We've talked about the fact that that's one of the reasons why probably the main reason why they rejected Christ is because he didn't overthrow Rome. They hated the Romans. Well, that led to groups of assassins, and there were assassinations taking place by the Jews of Roman officials or Roman-friendly Jewish people at this particular time. The relationship was getting so bad that it would not be that long until the Roman-Jewish wars begin to break out, only about a decade after the events of here with Paul. And so they know that it's just like the tide is about to break here. They understand that we have to keep these things down. We can't allow this thing to grow because they know that they're on the precipice of real fighting and real war. The relationship was that strained. And so this particular captain knows he has to shut this thing down fast. And so we see how important he sees this because it says that he brings soldiers and centurions, plural, not just a centurion. He brings soldiers and centurions. And so from that, we know that there were at least 200 Roman soldiers that came out to face this particular mob. I think it was probably a lot more than that, but we know that it was at least that. And so this is something that we know he sees as very, very serious. Now, as the Jews see and realize that the Roman soldiers are coming, it says that they left beating of Paul. And so again, we see similarities to Christ where as they're dragging Paul to what they believe will be his death, his murder, they're beating him the entire way. Well, the same thing was happening with Christ after his arrest. Long before he ever was scourged, long before he was ever put on the cross, he was being beaten the whole time. And so again, we see some similarities there that were taking place. And so interestingly enough, God used the Romans to save Paul's life. Right? Now, obviously, it didn't happen with Christ because it was a predetermined plan for Christ to die there. But God used the Romans to save him because the captain, it says, took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. Now, the fact that he was bound with 2 chains, what most people believe, and I think is likely true, is that he was probably chained to 2 Roman soldiers. He had one arm or leg chained to a Roman soldier on each side. There's no way he's getting away from this. Now, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. And I said we would come back to it, and this is the appropriate time to do this. So just to take just a minute here, this is a good time to ask this question. Was Agabus right? Was the prophecy of Agabus correct? So just to go back a little bit, back in the last chapter, It was earlier in this chapter. Agabus prophesied to Paul. He says, "Thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owneth this girdle, and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." And so if you remember, Agabus takes the girdle of Paul, binds his own hands with them, and then makes his prophecy. Whoever owns this girdle will be bound by the Jews and delivered over to the Gentiles. And so this is a text, a prophecy, and I mentioned this briefly when we went over it. But this is a prophecy that a lot of continuationists will take that particular prophecy by Agabus, and they will say that Agabus got it wrong, and because Agabus got it wrong, and yet the Bible seems to promote him as a true prophet, they will say that this is New Testament proof that there is no longer a required absolute infallibility for prophecy. In other words, what modern day prophets are doing, quote unquote prophets, by the way, what modern day prophets are doing is they're saying Agabus made a prophecy and got it wrong, and the Bible doesn't ever say anything about it. Therefore, I can make prophecies and get it wrong, and it doesn't matter. I can make prophecies all day long. I can make 1,000 wrong prophecies, and it never matters. That's what they'll claim. And we talked about that a little bit when we went through the New Apostolic Reformation study not that long ago. They have made many, many false prophecies, and yet they always just have this to fall back on. Well, Agabus got it wrong, right? Agabus got it wrong, and he was still a prophet. And so the question is, did he get it wrong, right? Because that's pretty important to their claim. And so what they'll say is that, well, Paul was actually bound by the Romans. We just read how the soldiers come in and they bound him. They say Paul was actually bound by the Romans, and then later at the end of chapter 22, he's actually handed over by the Romans back to the Jews. And so not only did Agabus get it wrong, he got it exactly opposite, right? He didn't just get it a little bit wrong, he got it 100% wrong. That's what they'll say. However, let me just say, the text here shows Paul was in control by the Jews. The Jews had him. They had seized him. They were taking him. They were dragging him out of the temple. They were beating him. There is no illusions here that Paul was not controlled by the Jews. And then what happens? The Romans show up, and then what happens? They let the Romans have him. And so there's absolute fulfillment of at least that part of Agabus' prophecy here, that he was handed over by the Jews to the Gentiles. Now, regarding the binding, and this is the more difficult one, regarding the binding, I think it likely that the Jewish people at the temple probably did bind him. And if they needed to bind him, probably the most convenient thing to use would have been his girdle. And I think it probably likely that they took that same girdle that Agabus bound himself with and bound Paul with, so that they could drag him out and constrain him, not only while they're beating him, so that they could eventually stone him to death. Right? That's what they were attempting to do. Now, again, that's my assumption. But at the end of the day, it's an argument from silence either way, because the Bible doesn't say. The Bible doesn't say that they bound him. The Bible doesn't say that they didn't bind him. And so the impetus is then upon them to say that they didn't, because, again, it's an argument from silence. And I would add this, that neither Paul nor Luke nor any other biblical author or the Holy Spirit ever say that Agabus got this wrong. Not once do we ever have an insinuation anywhere in Scripture that Agabus got this wrong. And then, on top of all of that, there is nothing in the New Covenant that would do away with the biblical commands for prophecy to be both true and accurate. Right? There's nothing that we see based upon the coming of Christ, his death on the cross, and his resurrection that would say, now prophets can get things wrong, and that's okay by God. Nowhere do we see that anywhere in Scripture. And so they're grasping at straws here to give a case for them, and they have to do this because they consistently get their prophecies wrong, because they're not really prophets, because they're not speaking for God. And so this is something that, again, I think it's important to understand. It's important to see where they're just kind of pulling at things to try and justify their own sinful situations. Now, as the captain, he's there, and he's got Paul. They finally have him, and they're carrying him off. He's trying to get some answers. And so it says at the end of verse 33 that he demanded who he was and what he had done, right? He's trying to figure out what in the world's going on. And so verse 34, and some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. Here's another proof that they didn't even know why they were doing what they were doing. Right? Nobody understands at this point. This was all false accusations from the very beginning. The mob that's beating him, about to kill him, don't even know why they're doing it. Right? And so he can't get a straight answer from anybody. And so he eventually has Paul taken back to what it's called here at the end of verse 34, to the castle. And the castle here, this is likely a reference to a fortress that was actually connected to the Temple Mount, and it was the fortress by the name of Antonia. And this was essentially this was a Roman garrison where they could station troops there, essentially for this purpose, right? To watch over the Temple Mount, to make sure things were going as they're supposed to be going. And it's the reason why, again, assuming that was the place, why they could get the troops there so quickly. They could look over the fortress into the Temple Mount. They could see what's going on. They get the troops there as fast as they need to. And so they're bringing Paul there, and there's steps leading up to it. The text mentions the steps. And so they're bringing him back to this fortress, Antonia. And as they're bringing him back to the fortress, the soldiers actually have to carry Paul. Because even though the Romans have already taken him, look, the Jewish people are still so angry. They're still trying to get at Paul so much that it says, for the violence of the people, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. And so even though the Roman soldiers have him now, the mob hasn't disseminated. They're still following after. Essentially, they're saying, if we can't kill him, you better. And we're gonna make sure that this happens. Again, we see some correlations between what happens here with Paul and what happened with Christ. And maybe you've already seen the correlation there. But as they're crying away with him, this is very reminiscent of the crowd when Jesus was standing before Pilate. And so in Luke 23:18, it says, and they cried out all at once, saying, away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas. In John chapter 19, it says, and it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So again, the same thing that they did to Jesus, they're trying to do to Paul. Now, as a note here, this is not only our last glimpse of the temple in the book of Acts. This is our last glimpse of the temple in the entire New Testament. There will be references made about the temple, but this is the last time we see the temple in the biblical text. And so while the soldiers are carrying away Paul, God is proverbially carrying away his blessing and favor because of the false religion of the Jews. And as I mentioned earlier, it would not be that long until the Roman-Jewish wars were going to break out. It would only be a few short years until the temple was destroyed in God's judgment against the very people who had rejected him and his prophets and his apostles and his people. And so this is a telling story here that this is the last time we ever see the temple in the New Testament. Now, as Paul is being taken into the castle, he asks the captain, in verse 37, he says, may I speak unto thee? A polite question, right? And may I speak unto thee? And the captain is shocked by this. It's kind of funny how taken aback by this. He said, can you speak Greek? This is not what he expected at all. You know, he can't. His mind is blown a little bit here. And so hearing Paul speak Greek just astonishes this man because he had assumed Paul to be an Egyptian outlaw. And you say, where did that come from? And so we know a little bit about this man from history. Again, I mentioned Josephus earlier. Josephus writes about this man. We never get his name, but he writes about this Egyptian man who claims to be a prophet. He claimed to be a prophet, and he led a large group of Jewish people. And just like it says there in verse 38, he leads them out into the wilderness. They had these plans, and he told all his followers that he was going to make the walls of Jerusalem fall down, and they were going to kind of storm Jerusalem and storm the Romans, and they were just going to take over Rome, right? They had all these grand plans. But as he leads them out into the wilderness, again, Felix, as is mentioned there, Felix finds out about this, and he goes out and he kills them. He kills a big number of them at least. And so the Egyptian man, though, was able to escape. He was able to get away, and it seems, now this part is a little bit harder to piece together, but it seems as though he would, after he escaped, he kind of led these groups of assassins that we referenced earlier. These assassins would come into Jerusalem during feast in particular, and they would hide daggers under their cloaks, They were referred to as dagger men, Sicarii. They would hide these daggers, and they would carry out these assassinations. And so the captain here assumes that the Jews saw that man, identified him, and that they had captured this Egyptian outlaw. And they had been after this man for some time. That was his assumption. Why that was his assumption, I don't know, but that was his assumption. And so when he hears Paul speak, obviously he's not an Egyptian. And not only is he not Egyptian, he speaks very clear and colloquial Greek. And so he's very surprised by this. And so Paul corrects him, and he tells him, no, I'm not Egyptian. He says, I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus. He says, no mean city. And from that, Tarsus was considered one of the learning capitals, one of the greatest centers of learning in the whole empire. Some of the best-known names as far as philosophy and things come out of Tarsus, or at least studied there. And so the Tarsus was a tremendously large center of learning in the Roman Empire. And so not only, and this does a couple of things, not only does this allow Paul to be in the temple where he was because he was a Jew, it also proves him to be a well-educated Roman citizen because he was from Tarsus. And that matters because no matter what the captain or the Jews or anybody else may have thought about Paul previously, what this proves is that he is not a threat to Jerusalem or Rome. He is not a threat here. He has been taken falsely. They've made wrong accusations about him. And in this one simple conversation, that captain now basically understands everything he needs to know at that point about Paul. And he understands this is all a farce. Everything that is taking place right now, this is false. This shouldn't have happened. And so he understands a little bit more about the man, Paul. Now, I want to quote John Phillips here because he makes an interesting point. He says, this seemingly insignificant incident, due to Paul's good education and cultured manner, is one of the turning points of history. From this moment on, the tribune, meaning the captain, the tribune took more than a passing interest in Paul and protected him from his enemies. Yet to Paul, it was the most natural thing in the world that he should address his captor in Greek and in a gentlemanly way. Thus, and here's his application, thus God uses the everyday things of life to carry on his purposes in the world. And such an interesting thought to make here because, again, Paul didn't know that the captain assumed him to be an Egyptian outlaw. He didn't know that. Paul didn't know that by simply asking a simple and polite question, may I speak unto thee, that would be the turning point in this whole ordeal, that whereas before the captain may have been at least a little sympathetic to them if he had been this Egyptian outlaw, now he understands he's not that man. He's a well-educated Roman citizen and a Jew allowed to be in the temple. He's not a threat to anybody. And so that one simple question, God used that to, again, turn this whole situation for Paul. And so Paul then asks of him, he says, I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. Let me get up and say something. It is interesting that Paul would request this, and even more interesting that the captain would grant it. Now, he does. Now, we won't be able to look at what Paul actually says for a couple of weeks. Next week we won't be in Acts. We'll be looking at the Christmas story. But for a couple of weeks, we won't actually see what Paul says. But he asks him, why, or asks him the opportunity to be able to stand and speak, and the captain allows him to do it. Paul would use this time to appeal to the Jews in that particular crowd about the truth of Jesus. And so perhaps he considers this an opportunity to quell the crowd, to kind of bring down the animosity that was taking place, and at best, perhaps even have some people come to believe in that Christ. But nevertheless, for the captain, it seems now that he knew, again, he knows Paul's to be an educated man, and possibly he thinks this could bring an end to this riot. Maybe the captain thinks, maybe they all think the same thing I think. Maybe they think he is that Egyptian man. I don't know. I don't know what the captain's thinking or why he allows it. It's an interesting thing that he does, but at the end of the day, he does. He allows Paul to speak. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, for the captain at this point, what he cares about is keeping the peace. And so he thinks somehow, some way, Paul getting up to speak will be able to keep the peace. And that's why he allows this. So given permission to speak, Paul stands and says he beckons with the hand unto the people. And what is almost missed and overlooked detail, and one of the most amazing things about this whole thing, in verse 40, Paul stood on the stairs, beckoned with the hand of the people, and when there was made a great silence. And so somehow, some way, this angry mob, this malicious, violent mob, who just seconds before wanted that man dead, to the point where they were beating him, dragging him about to stone him, to the point that the Roman soldiers had to carry Paul up the steps to Antonia because they were following after, yelling, "Away with him," being violent the whole time. Amazingly, Paul stands, beckons with the hand, and the whole crowd goes silent. Why would they do that? That is not the actions of a typical mob. Why they did that is because God was giving Paul the opportunity to speak the gospel to a group of people that desperately needed to hear it. Now again, we won't be able to look at that for a couple of weeks, but that's exactly what he's going to do. And he begins to speak. We see they're not in Greek this time, but in Hebrew. He's a Hebrew speaking to the Hebrews. And so by way of conclusion this morning, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. We know that Paul, all along, has had a desire to go to Rome. Now, he had plans on how that was going to happen. He wrote to the Romans that I'm going to go to Spain, and I'm going to stop in Rome on my way to Spain. Now, what's the built-in assumption there? That he was going to do that in freedom. That he, with his own free will, was going to get on a boat, sail to Spain, and stop in Rome on the way. And so Paul's plan was to go in freedom, but as we'll see, he's actually going to go in chains. Now, one way or another, God got him there. It didn't happen how he thought it was going to happen, but it did happen. Now, one of the saddest aspects about this whole scene is not necessarily the treatment of Paul by the mob. That's sad. I'm not trying to overlook that. However, godless people will act in godless ways. That's not surprising. That's not shocking to us that this crowd would do this. We've seen mobs throughout history. Godless people will act in godless ways. One of the saddest aspects about this, and it's something that is it's just because of its silence, the saddest aspect of this is the silence of the church. Paul was there to bring an offering by the Gentiles to the Jewish saints. Paul was there to help and to care for the Jerusalem church. Paul was only at the temple because the elders of that church asked him to go to the temple in order to ease and help the relationship between Paul and the other Jews. However, not once in this whole story, not once at any point after, here or in any the rest of the New Testament, do we see anyone from the church at Jerusalem ever reach out and try to help Paul. Paul was one to bend over backwards and do literally anything and everything he could to help another brother. That's the whole reason he's there. The whole reason he got arrested in the first place is because he was bending over backwards for other brothers in Christ. And yet when Paul was at this point in his greatest moment of need in his life, the brothers whom he was trying to help were nowhere to help him. And that, to me, is one of the saddest aspects of this whole story. So what do we do with this? Well, let me give you two very quick applications as we close. May we learn from this the biblical command to help our brothers when help is needed. John, the Apostle John, writes about this in 1 John 3, "Hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." For the brethren. But Paul wasn't just another random person. Paul wasn't just some other Jew in the temple and got himself into trouble. Paul was, first of all, there because you asked him to go, more or less told him to go. But also, beyond that, Paul is your brother in Christ. Jesus becomes the greatest example of this. At one point, Jesus is teaching a group of people, and his brothers and sisters come to him. His actual brothers and sisters come to him. And he's told, Jesus, your family is here. Your brothers are here. And Jesus says, who are my brothers? These are my brothers. This is my mother. This is my family. Right? And so here is Paul, their brother, their family. And they just let him be. You got yourself into some really bad stuff here, Paul. Hope you figure it out. Furthermore, and I'll end with this, let us understand that the world does not operate through fairness. However, as Peter says, this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it if when we are buffeted for your faults, you shall take it patiently. But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. Why was Paul arrested and beaten and almost killed this day? Not because of anything he did. It's because of what other people were saying about him. It's because of what other people thought about him. And all of it was done for the glory of God on the perspective of Paul. And so he says, what glory is it if you patiently suffer because of something you actually did? No, it's glorifying when you patiently suffer because of something you did for the sake of Christ. And then he goes on, because as always, let us yearn to follow Christ, because Peter says in the very next verse, he says, for even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. And so Paul here becomes an example following after Christ. And as he followed Christ, I pray that we would follow in the same footsteps. Let's pray.